Picture this. The only ground you have is a yard of pure dead sand, not soil, not a lawn, not one bed of dark crumbly earth, just a dry, pale, sun-baked patch of sand where the grass gave up years ago and even the weeds will not bother, the yard everyone looks at and says nothing grows there. And on that dead sand I am going to show you three things almost nobody believes. There is a crop that actually grows straighter and cleaner in loose sand than it does in a rich farm field. There is a whole family of the herbs you overpay for the most that would rather live in dry sand than in your good garden soil. And there is a corner of that pale baking yard that ripens tomatoes earlier and holds them later than a normal garden ever could, with no greenhouse at all. All of it on sand everybody wrote off. Start with the potatoes, because that is the moment that flips it in your head. At the end of summer, you walk out onto that dead sand, grab a grow bag standing on it, tip it straight over, and a pile of clean, fresh potatoes comes pouring out onto the sand with no digging and no fork. Potatoes you grew standing on a patch of ground that supposedly grows nothing. That is not a fantasy, and it is not a trick. A sandy yard is bone dry and looks useless, but it is quietly sitting on three gifts a normal garden fights all year to get. So this is the garden I would build if a yard of dead sand were all I had, and I will be honest with you in one sentence up front. You do not sow seed straight into the bare sand, and you do not grow a field of grain. You bring the soil to the sand in bags and beds, and let the sand do the draining and the warming. But the fresh vegetables you actually load into a cart every single week, the potatoes, the carrots, the salad, the tomatoes, the beans, the herbs you pay a fortune for and throw half away, that whole side of the shopping you can grow out there on the dead sand. Because here is the thing nobody tells you about a sandy yard. It already beats most gardens at the three things that matter most. It sits in full open sun with nothing shading it. It drains so fast your roots can never drown or rot, and that pale sand soaks up the day's heat and breathes it back at night like a warm bed under your plants. You just have to give it the one thing it does not have, a medium that holds water and food, and I will show you exactly how. Let me build it, bag by bag and bed by bed, starting with the heavy stuff you hate carrying home and the crop that will change how you see that sand for good. Station 1 is the heavy, boring, expensive stuff you lug home in a sack every week. Potatoes and root vegetables, and a dead sandy yard grows them for reasons a normal garden cannot match. Start with the potatoes because they need nothing from the ground at all. Stand a few deep grow bags or old compost sacks right on the sand, fill them with a decent soil mix, and push a couple of seed potatoes into each one. That is the whole setup. No bed, no digging, no forking. Here is the trick that makes bags beat a border. As the plant grows, you keep mounding more soil up around the stem, and it keeps setting potatoes up the buried stalk, so a tall bag turns a couple of seed potatoes into a surprising haul stacked all the way up. And here is the payoff moment, the one I opened on. When they are ready, you do not dig. You just grab the bag and tip it straight out onto the sand, and a clean pile of potatoes rolls out with not one of them speared or cut in half by a fork. Now the part that changes how you see the whole yard. Right next to the bags, build one raised bed, a simple frame on the sand, and fill it with loose soil and compost for your carrots, your beetroot, and your parsnips. Because here is the counterintuitive truth that opens this entire video. Root crops grow straighter, cleaner, and longer in light, loose, sandy ground than they ever do in heavy, stony soil. In a normal garden, every stone in the ground forks a carrot or stunts a parsnip. Loose, sandy media has no stones at all, so the roots slide straight down, long and clean. That dead sand everybody pities is for a carrot or a beetroot or a parsnip, closer to the perfect bed than a rich stony border ever was. Add the depth and the compost, and for roots your sandy yard genuinely beats a farm field. A few bags and one loose bed quietly stand in for the heaviest, most rebought corner of the cart, but the next station is the one you rebuy the most and waste the fastest, and the sand makes it quicker still. Station 2 is the fresh stuff that goes slimy before you can eat it. Station 2 is the fresh stuff that goes off the fastest and that you rebuy every single trip. Salad, and on a sandy yard you do not grow a pot of it, you grow a production line. Line up a run of wide, shallow troughs or a long, low bed along the sunniest edge of the sand, and here is why the sand wins for salad. It warms up fast and it drains sharp, so seed germinates quickly and never sits in cold, soggy wet. Fill the troughs with loose leaf greens, leaf lettuce, spinach, rocket, a little kale, and sow radish in the gaps. Now the one trick most people get wrong: you do not grow a lettuce, wait for a full head and cut it down. You sow them close and you harvest, cut and come again, taking only the outer leaves and leaving the growing point in the middle, so one sowing hands you salad for weeks, not one bowl. And because you have a whole row of troughs, you sow a little of each a couple of weeks apart, so as one is picked out, the next is coming ready, a rolling supply instead of a glut and then nothing. The radish is your fast win in the gaps. Seed to a crisp, peppery pull is often only around 3 to 4 weeks, and the warm, free-draining sand pushes them along faster than a bag of salad goes slimy in the fridge, and the radish leaves go straight in the same bowl too. A run of shallow troughs on that sand can hand you a fresh salad most days of the week, about a minute from yard to plate. But the next station is the one everybody assumes you need a greenhouse for, and the pale sand grows it better than a shaded garden ever could. Station 3 is where the dead yard turns into a sun trap. Station 3 is where the sandy yard does something a normal shaded garden simply cannot, and it is the crop people assume you need a greenhouse for: tomatoes, peppers, and chilies. Here is the whole secret, and it is the reason to grow them right out on the open sand. A dead sandy yard is usually wide open with nothing around it, no overhanging trees, no crowding hedge, no wall next door throwing shade, so it sits in full sun from the first light to the last, and that pale sand is a heat battery. Light-colored sand soaks up the sun all day and holds real warmth, and after the sun goes down it breathes that heat back up into the plants standing on it, like a free warm bed with no glass to buy. On top of that, the pale surface bounces extra light back up into the leaves. All that open sun, stored heat, and reflected light can ripen your fruit earlier in the year and hold it going later than the same plant would manage in a shaded, sheltered garden. Stand your grow bags of tomatoes, peppers, and chilies in the most open part of the sand. Give them a sturdy cane or a string so the breeze does not rock them, and here is the second surprise that keeps the harvest coming. The more you pick, the more they set, because the plant is only trying to make seed, so every fruit you take pushes it to flower and try again. The hottest, sunniest, most useless-looking corner you own turns out to be the best tomato spot on the property, and a few bags on the sand grow the summer crops people buy whole glass houses for. Before I build the next 3, stop and look at what this dead yard is already holding. Station 4 turns the sandy yard's one real weakness into a wall of food. So look at what the sand holds already. Bags of potatoes and a bed of carrots and beetroot growing straighter than they would in good soil, a long production line of salad, and the sunniest corner of tomatoes and peppers on the whole property. Stop and notice what that is, because that is already the heaviest, the freshest, and the most expensive corners of the cart: the carbs and roots, the salad and the summer fruit, all grown on a patch of dead sand that used to grow nothing at all. The next 3 are what turn a good haul into never buying vegetables again: the crop that grows straight up out of the wind and shelters everything behind it, the flavor you overpay for the very worst and that would rather live on your sand than in your soil, and the one move that keeps the whole yard feeding you when everyone else's garden has gone bare and rotted off for the winter. Quick question while we are here, and I do read every reply: what is the one vegetable you are most tired of paying for? Tell me in the comments. I am genuinely curious what tops your list. Now Station 4, and it takes the exposed, breezy, sandy yard's biggest problem and turns it into a living wall of beans. Station 4 takes the one thing that makes an open, sandy yard hard to garden, the wind and the exposure, and turns it into a crop. A flat, open patch of sand catches every breeze, that is true, so instead of fighting it, you grow a windbreak you can eat, straight up into the air where there is nothing but empty space. Lean a slim trellis or run a few strings up a light frame at the windward edge of the sand, stand a pot at the bottom, and send up climbers, runner beans, peas, and cucumbers. This is the heavy hitter for the space it takes, because a climbing bean is one of the most generous things you can grow for its footprint, one pot no bigger than a dinner plate, a few strings, and the plant does all its growing in the air instead of sprawling across the ground. And here is the clever part. The reason this station is made for a sandy yard, that green curtain of climbing leaves does not just feed you, it filters the wind, calming the breeze for every pot and bed sitting behind it, so the exposure that makes the yard hard becomes the thing that shelters the whole garden. There is a bonus underground too. Beans and peas are legumes, so they quietly pull nitrogen out of the air and feed it into that hungry, nutrient-poor sand, giving something back instead of only taking. Beans and cucumbers do the same generous trick as the tomatoes. The more you pick the young ones, the more the plant sets, so a single row up a string can hand you beans and cucumbers for weeks from a pot you can step around. You have turned the sandy yard's biggest weakness into a living wall that feeds you, shelters everything else, and even feeds the sand. Station 5 is the flavor that turns a pile of veg into actual meals, and it is another crop the dead sand was secretly built for. Station 5 is the flavor and the near-free stuff, the herbs, the green onions, and one big generous plant, and this is the corner of the produce section you overpay for the very worst, and the one the sand loves the most. Think about how herbs are sold. A few cut sprigs, sealed in a stiff plastic clamshell, one of the highest prices by weight in the whole store, and they turn to slime in the fridge in days, so half of every pack goes in the bin. It is the worst value on the shelf and the easiest thing of all to replace, and here is the surprise that makes this station perfect for a sandy yard. A whole family of herbs, the Mediterranean ones, rosemary, thyme, oregano, and sage, actually prefer dry, sharp, sandy ground. They come from hot, poor, stony hillsides, so the fast-draining sand that would starve a lettuce is exactly the home they want, and the wet, rich soil people usually give them is what rots them. So line up pots of the ones you cook with most, the Mediterranean herbs right out where the sand is driest, plus basil, parsley, and a pot of mint kept on its own because it will bully everything next to it. Here is the spike, and it is almost too easy. One living herb pot you snip from all season costs about what a single clamshell does, except it never stops. The Mediterranean herbs come back year after year and shrug off the dry sand that kills fussier plants. Basil and parsley regrow the more you pinch them, and green onions will regrow from the white root ends you were about to throw away, so push those scraps into a pot, and that little patch is effectively free forever. And leave room out there for one big generous courgette plant, because a single healthy one is famous for burying you in fruit all summer long from one pot, the very definition of never buying that vegetable again. Flavor from the crop your sand was built for, free onions from your scraps, and one plant that will not stop feeding you. But there is one station left, and it is the one that actually earns the word never. Station 6 is the move almost everyone skips, and the sand is quietly great at it. Station 6 is the one that earns the word never in never buy vegetables again, and it is the station almost everyone skips. Here is the mistake most people make. They fill the yard once in spring, pick through the warm months, and by autumn the beds are spent, everything winds down, and they drift straight back to the vegetable aisle for more than half the year. The fix has two easy parts, and neither is hard. First, succession, which simply means the day a bag or a bed finishes, something goes straight back in. When the early potatoes come out, that soil grows a batch of autumn greens, and when a lettuce bolts, the trough gets rezoned the same afternoon. Second, and this is the surprise that makes never realistic, you lean into the cold because a lot of good, expensive vegetables actually prefer it. Hardy kale, leeks, chard, winter lettuce, spinach, and rocket keep growing through chilly weather, and here is where the sandy yard quietly wins the whole year. It drains hard and fast, so it dodges the cold, soggy wet that rots so much winter veg in a heavy garden bed. The number one killer of winter crops is not the cold, it is the wet, cold ground sitting soggy around the roots, and sharp sand simply never does that. Tuck those beds in behind your bean wall windbreak, out of the wind, lay a cheap clear cloche or cover over them on the coldest nights, and you keep cutting fresh leaves and pulling leeks deep into the cold months, exactly when those same vegetables are at their most expensive and their least fresh in the store. Most yards go bare in autumn, not because they have to, but because nobody replanted them, and because wet ground rotted what was left. Your sharp, dry sand skips that problem, so keep the beds turning over and the yard keeps you out of the vegetable aisle for nearly the whole year. That is the whole build. Now here is how you run it so it actually replaces the shopping instead of just decorating a patch of sand. Here is the part that ties a dozen bags and beds into one working garden instead of a dozen separate ones, and it is the reason a dead patch of sand can genuinely keep you out of the vegetable aisle. The whole thing comes down to one idea: you do not fight the sand, you use it. A sandy yard hands you three gifts a normal garden fights all year to get: full open sun, fast sharp drainage, and stored heat, and it is short on exactly one thing: a medium that holds water and food. So the system is four simple rules. First, bring the soil to the sand. Everything grows in bags, troughs, and raised beds of good soil and compost standing on the sand, never in the bare sand itself, so you get the sand's sun, drainage, and warmth with real growing medium on top. Second, put the right crop where the sand is at its most extreme. The root crops and the Mediterranean herbs go where the sand is loosest and driest, because that is not a compromise for them, it is their favorite home, and the sun and heat lovers, the tomatoes and peppers, go out in the most open baking light. Third, feed little and often, because this is the one honest catch of the whole build, and I will say it plainly once. Sand is nutrient poor and it does not hold water, so free-draining containers and beds on sand need regular watering and a little steady feeding, a light feed often rather than a big one rarely, and a mulch on top to slow the water leaking away. That is the trade for all that sun and drainage, and it is an easy one. Fourth, the big one: never leave a bed bare. The day you tip a bag out, refill it that same day. Something fast in the troughs, something climbing on the strings, never a patch of empty soil sitting there wasting a month of the best sun on the property. Do those four things, and the sandy yard is always growing something, which is the only way it adds up to a real dent in the shopping. And one quiet bonus of building it all in bags and beds standing on the sand: you never dug up or altered the ground. Nothing is permanent. You can slide a bag to chase the sun, and if you ever move, the whole garden comes with you. Grow what your family actually eats, and the payoff is not a tidied-up sandpit, it is the evening you cook dinner from a yard of sand and realize the veg drawer in the fridge has been empty for weeks because you stopped filling it. That is the system, not better ground, a fuller yard. So that is the garden I would build if a yard of dead sand were all I had. Bags of potatoes you tip out on the sand, and a bed of carrots and beetroot growing straighter than they would in good soil. A production line of cut-and-come-again salad, the sunniest heat store corner of tomatoes and peppers on the property, a living wall of beans and cucumbers that shelters the rest from the wind and feeds the sand, Mediterranean herbs and onions, and a courgette that will not quit, and cool season greens that dodge the winter rot to carry it through the cold, every bed refilled the day it empties, so it almost never stops. This channel is called 1 Acre Blueprint, and by now the real lesson is clear. The blueprint was never really about the acre, and it was never about the quality of the ground. It is about how hard each square foot works, and a dead patch of sand, used properly instead of fought, can keep a family out of the vegetable aisle for most of the year. Do not try to build all of it at once. Start with one thing this week: a bag of potatoes for the satisfying tip-out haul, or a trough of salad if you want to be picking in a few weeks, or a pot of rosemary and thyme that finally has the dry, sandy home it always wanted. Subscribe to stay on the 1 Acre Blueprint, because next we take this exact idea one step further, wrapping the whole yard, the fence line, and the walls into one year-round food yard that feeds a family from the same dead ground everyone else gave up on. And tell me in the comments, if a yard of pure sand were all you had, which of these 6 would you build first?